Picture this. A movement that began with a handful of fishermen and outcasts spreads like wildfire across the ancient world, defying the most powerful empire in human history. For 3 centuries, Christians face unspeakable tortures, are fed to lions, and die gruesome deaths rather than bow to Caesar. Their blood waters the seeds of faith that grow in secret, in homes and hidden gatherings, far from the marble halls of power. Then something extraordinary happens. In the span of a single generation, everything changes. The empire that once hunted Christians suddenly embraces them. The faith that preached turning the other cheek becomes the sword of imperial conquest. The religion of the poor and persecuted transforms into the gilded throne of earthly power. What you're about to discover will shake everything you thought you knew about Christianity. This isn't just ancient history gathering dust in forgotten libraries. This is the moment when the pure stream of early Christian faith was diverted into the machinery of empire, forever altering the spiritual DNA of Western civilization. Welcome to the story of the greatest religious hijacking in human history, the story of how Rome didn't just adoptically rewrote its very soul Christianity, but systemat. But before we dive into this earth-shattering transformation, you need to understand what Christianity actually looked like before Rome got its hands on it. Because the Christianity that emerged from the catacombs was nothing like what it became in the palaces of power. The early Christian movement was revolutionary in ways that would terrify modern religious institutions. These weren't people building cathedrals or amassing political influence. They were ordinary people who had encountered something so powerful it was worth dying for. Slaves sat next to free citizens. Women held positions of leadership that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. Jews and Gentiles broke bread together in defiance of every social norm. Their gatherings happened in homes, not temples. Their leaders were chosen by communities, not appointed by hierarchies. They shared everything in common, caring for widows and orphans with a devotion that amazed even their persecutors. This was Christianity in its raw, unfiltered form, powered by conviction rather than convention. But here's what made them truly dangerous to Rome. They refused to worship the emperor. In a world where religious loyalty meant political loyalty, Christians stood apart. They claimed allegiance to a higher king, a kingdom not of this world. This wasn't just theological rebellion, it was treason against the very foundation of imperial authority. For nearly 3 centuries, wave after wave of persecution crashed against these believers. Diocletian's persecution alone lasted 8 years, unleashing horrors that defy description. Christians were burned alive, crucified, thrown to wild beasts, and tortured in ways designed to break not just their bodies but their spirits. Yet through it all, the movement grew stronger. Then came Constantine. The year was 312 CE, and 2 armies faced each other at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome. Constantine, fighting for control of the empire, claimed to see a vision in the sky, a cross with the words, "In this sign, conquer." What happened next would reshape the course of human history. Constantine won the battle, and Christianity would never be the same. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because Constantine's conversion wasn't quite what it seemed. This wasn't Paul on the road to Damascus, struck blind by divine light. This was something far more calculated, far more political than the Sunday school version suggests. Constantine waited until he was literally on his deathbed to be baptized. For 25 years after his supposed conversion, he continued minting coins with pagan gods. The Arch of Constantine, built to celebrate his victory, contains not a single Christian symbol. Instead, it's decorated with offerings to Apollo, Diana, and Hercules. This wasn't the conversion of a true believer. This was the move of a master politician who recognized an opportunity when he saw one. You see, Constantine inherited a fractured empire tearing itself apart. Previous emperors had tried to unite their subjects through force, through shared enemies, through the old gods. Nothing worked. The empire was bleeding from 1,000 wounds, and traditional Roman religion offered no cure. But Christianity was different. It was growing despite persecution, spreading across every corner of the empire. More importantly, it preached unity, submission to authority, and peace. From Constantine's perspective, this wasn't just a religion, it was the perfect tool for imperial control. The numbers tell the story. When Constantine came to power, Christians made up perhaps 5% of the empire's population. Tiny by modern standards, but they were organized, they were passionate, and they were everywhere. They had already done the hard work of building networks across ethnic and social lines. All Constantine had to do was harness that energy for his own purposes. And harness it he did. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE didn't just legalize Christianity. It began the process of transforming it. Suddenly, being Christian wasn't a path to martyrdom, but a path to preferment. Churches that had hidden in shadows found themselves showered with imperial gold. Bishops who had dodged Roman soldiers now dined at the emperor's table. But here's what most people miss about the Edict of Milan. It didn't make Christianity the official religion of Rome. That would come later. What it did was something far more subtle and far more dangerous. It made Christianity useful to Rome. Constantine understood what modern politicians understand. You don't need to believe in something to use it. You just need to control it. And the easiest way to control a religion is to make its leaders dependent on your favor. The transformation was swift and devastating. Church buildings began to mirror Roman architecture, with basilicas replacing house churches. Elaborate rituals replaced simple communion meals. Professional clergy replaced community leaders. The horizontal fellowship of equals became the vertical hierarchy of empire. This is where the story takes its darkest turn, because Constantine didn't just want to use Christianity, he wanted to define it. And that brings us to one of the most consequential moments in Christian history, the Council of Nicaea. In 325 CE, Constantine summoned bishops from across the empire to his palace. The official reason was to resolve a theological dispute about the nature of Christ. But the real agenda was far more ambitious: to create a unified Christianity that could serve as the spiritual cement of his empire. Picture the scene. Hundreds of bishops, many still bearing scars from recent persecutions, suddenly find themselves in the imperial palace. They're surrounded by the luxury and power they'd been taught to despise, and presiding over their theological discussions is a man who, by their own standards, was still a pagan. Constantine opened the council dressed like some heavenly angel of God, as one witness described it. His purple robes glittered with gold and precious stones. He spoke in Latin while most of the bishops spoke Greek. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was Rome's council, not Christianity's. The emperor made his priorities clear from the start. He didn't care about theological subtleties. What he cared about was unity. As he put it, the dispute over Christ's nature was insignificant. What mattered was ending the divisions that threatened his newly useful religion. This was the moment when Christianity began its transformation from a grassroots movement into an institutional religion. The bishops at Nicaea weren't just defining doctrine, they were accepting a new role as agents. They were trading of imperial authority their independence for influence, their prophetic voice for political power, and Constantine made sure they understood the new arrangement. Bishops who agreed with the majority position received imperial favor. Those who dissented faced exile. This wasn't theological debate. It was political coercion dressed up in religious language. The Council of Nicaea established a precedent that would echo through centuries. Secular rulers had the right and responsibility to define Christian orthodoxy. The Church that had once defied imperial authority now depended on it for legitimation of Constantine's strategy, real geniusacy. But that what he did to Christianity, it was what he allowed Christianity to do to itself. By offering imperial patronage, he created a system where Christian leaders competed for his favor. The horizontal unity of early Christianity fractured into vertical hierarchies of power and privilege. Bishops began to dress like Roman senators. Churches began to accumulate vast wealth. Theological disputes became political battles fought with imperial weapons. The faith that had once challenged the powerful became a tool for suppressing the powerless. This transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was irreversible. Once Christianity became entangled with imperial power, it could never again be the religion of the catacombs. It had been domesticated, institutionalized, and weaponized for purposes its founders never imagined. The early Christians had faced persecution from without. Now they faced something far more insidious: corruption from within. The empire that couldn't destroy Christianity through violence succeeded in transforming it through embrace. This is the great tragedy of Christian history. Not that believers were fed to lions, but that their successors chose to become the lion tamers. Not that they were crucified by Rome, but that they learned to wield the hammer and nails themselves. The hijacking was complete, but the full horror of what Constantine had unleashed was yet to come. The real horror story begins in the decades following Nicaea, when Rome completed its masterpiece of religious engineering. What emerged wasn't just a transformed Christianity. It was something entirely new, wearing the mask of the old faith. By 380 CE, Emperor Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. But this wasn't the Christianity of the apostles or the martyrs. This was Roman Christianity, forged in the furnaces of imperial ambition and tempered by the hammers of political necessity. The transformation was so complete that within a single generation, the persecuted had become the persecutors. The faith that had once been hunted through the streets of Rome now hunted its own enemies with the same ruthless efficiency that had once been turned against it. Imagine the bitter irony. Christians who had hidden in catacombs, who had watched their brothers and sisters torn apart by wild beasts, who had sung hymns while flames consumed their flesh, now wielded the same imperial power that had tormented them. The cross that had been their symbol of suffering became their weapon of conquest. This wasn't gradual drift or theological evolution. This was systematic replacement. Every aspect of early Christian identity was methodically stripped away and replaced with something that served Rome's purposes. The horizontal became vertical. The communal became hierarchical. The spiritual became political. The bishops, who had once been shepherds of small communities, found themselves transformed into princes of the church. They wore silk robes instead of simple tunics. They ruled from marble palaces instead of humble homes. They commanded armies of bureaucrats instead of gathering with a handful of believers around a simple table. But the most devastating change wasn't in how they lived, it was in how they thought. The early Christians had seen themselves as aliens and exiles, citizens of a heavenly kingdom that stood in judgment over earthly powers. Now they saw themselves as partners with those powers, agents of divine authority working through imperial mechanisms. This shift in identity unleashed consequences that would echo through centuries. When you believe you're acting for God through the mechanisms of state power, there's no limit to what you can justify. When you convince yourself that political authority carries divine sanction, every enemy becomes a heretic, and every disagreement becomes blasphemy. The church that had once proclaimed wealth. The movement Good News to the Poor now accumulated vast that had welcomed outcasts now excluded those who didn't conform. The faith that had turned the other cheek now struck with the sword of imperial law, and Rome was delighted. Constantine's gamble had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. Not only had he gained a useful religion, he had created a system of control more effective than anything previous emperors had imagined. The Christians weren't just obeying Caesar, they were convincing themselves that obeying Caesar was obeying God. This was the genius of the Roman hijacking. They didn't destroy Christianity, they didn't even suppress it. They transformed it into something that served their purposes better than their own traditional religion ever had. They turned the most revolutionary force in the ancient world into the most conservative. The process accelerated under Theodosius, who understood that half measures wouldn't suffice. If Christianity was to serve as the spiritual backbone of the empire, it needed to be purged of anything that might challenge imperial authority. Dissenting voices were silenced. Alternative interpretations were banned. The rich diversity to a single, state of early Christian thought was reduce-approved formula. But Theodosius went further than his predecessors. He did in Christianity. He wanted to weep, just want to use of Thessalonica wasn't Justinize it. The edict about making Christianity official, it was about making everything else illegal. Pagan temples were closed. Traditional festivals were banned. Ancient priesthoods were dissolved. The religion of love and forgiveness became the instrument of persecution and oppression. Christian mobs, encouraged by imperial law and blessed by church authorities, rampaged through cities destroying temples and libraries. The great library of Alexandria, repository of ancient wisdom, was sacked by Christian zealots who saw knowledge itself as a threat to their newfound power. This wasn't the passionate but misconverts. This was systematic, guided enthusiasm of new cultural destruction orchestrated from the highest levels of church and state. The bishops who ordered these attacks weren't wild-eyed fanatics. They were sophisticated political operators who understood exactly what they were doing. They were erasing the memory of what came before. By destroying the temples, they eliminated alternative sources of spiritual authority. By burning the books, they controlled what future generations would know about the past. By silencing dissent, they created the illusion that their version of Christianity was the only version that had ever existed. The tragedy wasn't just what was destroyed, it was what was created in its place. The institutional church that emerged from this process bore almost no resemblance to the movement that had begun 3 centuries earlier. It had the same vocabulary but an entirely different meaning. It used the same scriptures but reached completely different conclusions. Where early Christians had seen Jesus as a figure who challenged earthly power, the imperial church portrayed him as the ultimate source of earthly authority. Where the apostles had established communities of equals, the bishops created rigid hierarchies of command and obedience. Where the martyrs had chosen death rather than compromise with Caesar, their successors chose partnership with Caesar's successors. The transformation was so complete that when later historians looked back, they could barely recognize the connection between the two movements. The Christianity of the catacombs and the Christianity of the cathedrals might as well have been different religions entirely. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the hijacking was how it concealed itself. The new Christianity didn't present itself as a replacement of the old. It claimed to be the authentic fulfillment of what had always been intended. The bishops who accumulated vast wealth claimed they were following apostolic example. The emperors who persecuted heretics claimed they were protecting orthodox faith. The church that had become indistinguishable from the state claimed it was serving a higher kingdom. This wasn't just institutional change. It was the systematic rewriting of Christian memory. Every compromise was justified as faithfulness. Every accommodation to power was presented as obedience to God. Every departure from the original vision was defended as theological development. The early Christians had been revolutionaries who turned the world upside down. Their successors became conservatives who worked tirelessly to keep the world right side up. The faith that had challenged every assumption of the ancient world became the defender of a new set of assumptions that were, in many ways, even more oppressive than what had come before. This is how empires always work. They don't destroy what they can't defeat, they absorb it. They don't suppress movements that threaten them, they co-opt them. They don't eliminate opposing voices, they give them new scripts to read. Rome had learned this lesson through centuries of conquest. They had absorbed Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, and Persian customs, always managing to turn foreign influences into Roman advantages. Christianity was just their greatest triumph in this ancient art of cultural assimilation. But the cost was enormous. In gaining the whole world, Christianity had lost its soul. In accepting earthly power, it had abandoned its heavenly vision. In becoming useful to Caesar, it had forgotten how to challenge Caesar. The hijacking was complete, but the most devastating consequences were still to come. Because once Christianity became the religion of empire, it began to behave like an empire. And empires, as history teaches us, always demand submission from those they claim to serve. The most chilling part of this story isn't what Rome did to Christianity, it's what Christianity willingly became in the process. Because by the time Theodosius finished his work, something unprecedented had occurred in human history. The religion that had been born in opposition to empire had become the empire itself. Picture the scene in 391 CE, when Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria led a Christian mob to destroy the Serapeum, one of the ancient world's most magnificent temples. This wasn't some spontaneous outburst of religious fervor. This was a carefully orchestrated operation, planned in the halls of power and executed with military precision. The bishop didn't just destroy the temple, he made sure to do it publicly, dramatically, sending a message that echoed across the empire. The old gods were dead, was onlied. Their ways were finish the old one acceptable form of worship now, and it would be enforced with all the brutal efficiency that Rome had once used against Christians themselves. But here's what makes this moment so haunting. Many of the Christians participating in this destruction were the children and grandchildren of martyrs. Their parents had died rather than burn incense to pagan gods. Now, they were burning the temples of those same gods, convinced they were doing God's work. The transformation was so complete that they couldn't even see the contradiction. The faith that had taught them to love their enemies was now teaching them to destroy their enemies' places of worship. The religion that had proclaimed freedom of conscience was now demanding uniformity of belief. The movement that had started with "Blessed are the peacemakers" had become the enforcer of imperial peace through violence. This wasn't just institutional change, this was spiritual amnesia on a massive scale. The Church had forgotten its own origin so completely that it began to persecute people for the same kinds of beliefs that had once defined Christianity itself. Take the treatment of heretics, for example. The early Christians had been called heretics by the Roman establishment. They had been accused of sedition, of undermining social order, of following dangerous and subversive teachings. Now, the Christian establishment was using exactly the same language against anyone who disagreed with imperial Christianity. The Donatists in North Africa learned this lesson the hard way. These Christians had the audacity to believe that clergy who had compromised during the persecutions shouldn't be allowed to return to leadership. They wanted to maintain the purity that had once defined the entire movement. For this crime of conscience, they were hunted down by Roman soldiers acting on orders from Christian bishops. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most revered figures in Christian history, personally appealed to the imperial government to use force against these dissidents. The man, who would later write eloquently about grace and love, saw no contradiction in using state violence to compel religious conformity. Compel them to come in, he argued, twisting Jesus' parable about a wedding feast into a justification for persecution. This is when you realize the full horror of what had happened. The church hadn't just accepted imperial methods, it had embraced logic. The imperial dissent was treason. Alternative interpretations were sedition. Theological disagreement was rebellion against God himself. The machinery of persecution that had once ground up Christians was retooled and turned against anyone who dared to maintain the kind of independence that had once characterized the entire movement. The cross that had been their symbol of suffering became their instrument of inflicting suffering on others. But the most devastating aspect of this transformation was how it corrupted the very message of Christianity itself. The gospel that had once proclaimed liberation for captives now created new forms of captivity. The faith that had announced good news to the poor now accumulated wealth that would make Roman senators jealous. The religion that had welcomed outcasts now established new categories of outcasts to exclude and persecute. And through it all, the church maintained that nothing had changed. They were still following Christ, they insisted. They were still preaching the same gospel, they claimed. They were still the same movement that had emerged from the hills of Galilee, they declared. This is perhaps the most tragic part of the entire story. The hijacking was so successful that even the victims didn't realize they had been hijacked. The institutional church genuinely believed it was preserving Christianity by transforming it into something completely foreign to its origins. The bishops, who accumulated vast estates, convinced themselves they were practicing apostolic poverty. The emperors, who used Christianity to justify conquest, convinced themselves they were spreading the kingdom of God. The theologians, who developed elaborate justifications for violence, convinced themselves they were defending the Prince of Peace. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but it was also necessary. Because once you've accepted that serving empire is serving God, you have to find ways to explain away everything that suggests otherwise. You have to reinterpret the scriptures that call wealth dangerous and poverty blessed. You have to explain away the examples of early Christians who refused military service. You have to find theological reasons for why the church that began as a persecuted minority should now persecute minorities itself. This process of rationalization created a new kind of Christianity, one that could justify almost anything as long as it served the interests of church and state. The flexibility was remarkable. The same theological framework that had once produced martyrs now produced inquisitors. The same scriptural foundation that had once inspired radical generosity now inspired spectacular accumulation of wealth. The genius of the Roman system was that it didn't require Christians to abandon their faith. It just required them to redefine it. They could keep their scriptures as long as they interpreted them correctly. They could maintain their traditions as long as they practiced them safely. They could preserve their identity as long as they understood that identity in ways that served imperial purposes. This wasn't just political manipulation, it was psychological warfare on a civilizational scale. Rome had discovered something that previous empires had missed. You don't need to destroy a religion to neutralize it, you just need to redirect it. You don't need to silence prophetic voices, you just need to give them official positions that require them to speak in officially approved ways. The transformation created a new kind of religious leader, one who could speak the language of spirituality while thinking in categories of political power. These weren't necessarily cynical manipulators, though some certainly were. Many of them genuinely believed they were serving God by serving empire. They had been so thoroughly formed by the new system that they couldn't imagine any alternative. This is how institutional capture works. It doesn't require conscious conspiracy. It just requires structural incentives that reward certain behaviors and punish others. When being a faithful Christian leader means maintaining good relationships with imperial authorities, then faithful Christian leaders learn to prioritize those relationships. When theological correctness is defined by political authorities, then theologians learn to think in politically acceptable ways. The early church had been sustained by people who were willing to lose everything for their convictions. The imperial church was sustained by people who were willing to adjust their convictions to avoid losing anything. The difference wasn't just in their circumstances, it was in their fundamental understanding of what faithfulness looked like. For the early Christians, faithfulness meant being willing to stand alone against the world if necessary. For the imperial Christians, faithfulness meant being willing to stand with the world against anyone who threatened its stability. The inversion was complete, and once this new understanding took hold, it became self-perpetuating. Each generation of church leaders was trained by the previous generation to see their role in terms of maintaining institutional stability rather than challenging systemic injustice. Each new bishop learned from his predecessors that the key to success was managing relationships with political authorities rather than prophetically confronting them. The result was a religious establishment that could absorb almost any amount of wealth, power, and privilege without seeing any contradiction with its supposed commitment to the carpenter from Nazareth who had nowhere to lay his head. The cognitive architecture had been so thoroughly rebuilt that the contradictions simply couldn't be seen by those operating within the system. This is the true measure of Rome's success. They didn't just change Christianity's behavior, they changed its perception of itself. They didn't just alter its practices, they transformed its understanding of what those practices meant. They didn't just redirect its energy, they convinced it that the redirection was actually a fulfillment of its original purpose. The hijacking was so complete that when later generations looked back, they couldn't even imagine what Christianity might have been like without Roman influence. The imperial version had become so normative that alternatives seemed not just wrong, but literally unthinkable. But the story doesn't end with successful institutional capture. Because empires, no matter how sophisticated their methods of control, always overreach. And when they do, they reveal the true cost of what they've demanded from those they claim to serve. The bill for Rome's transformation of Christianity was about to come due, and the price would be paid in ways that neither Constantine nor his successors could have imagined. The price came due sooner than anyone expected, and it was paid in blood that flowed from places that had never known persecution before. What happened next reveals the most sinister aspect of Rome's masterpiece. Because once Christianity became the official religion of empire, it didn't just gain the power to persecute others, it gained the obligation to do so. The machinery of state violence that had once hunted Christians was now operated by Christians, and they wielded it with a zeal that would have impressed Diocletian himself. The transformation was breadth and scope. Within taking in its speed decades of the Edict of Thessalonica, the empire that had once been a refuge for religious diversity became a nightmare of enforced conformity. Temples were shuttered not by angry mobs but by imperial decree. Priests were exiled not by local governors but by Christian bishops. Libraries were burned not in fits of passion but as acts of official policy. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. The persecution unleashed by Christianized Rome wasn't random violence or spontaneous religious fervor. It was systematic, bureaucratic, and devastatingly effective. The Church had learned from its own suffering, and now it applied those lessons with clinical precision. Take what happened to the philosophers and scholars who had preserved the ancient wisdom traditions. These weren't wild pagans conducting bloody sacrifices or threatening public order. These were teachers and thinkers who had maintained libraries, schools, and intellectual traditions that stretched back centuries. Their crime wasn't violence or sedition, it was thinking thoughts that didn't align with the new Christian orthodoxy. Hypatia of Alexandria embodied everything the old world had represented. She was a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher who taught students from across the Mediterranean. Her school was a place where ideas were debated freely, where questions were welcomed, where knowledge was pursued for its own sake. In the old Rome, she would have been honored as a treasure of the empire. In Christian Rome, she was a threat that needed to be eliminated. In 415 CE, a Christian mob dragged her from her chariot, stripped her naked, and scraped her flesh from her bones with oyster shells until she died. The bishop who orchestrated this murder wasn't some fringe fanatic, he was Cyril of Alexandria, later declared a saint by the Church. The men who carried out the killing weren't criminals or outcasts, they were church officials acting ecclesiast-withical approval. This wasn't an isolated incident or a moment of tragic excess. This was the new normal. The faith that had once produced martyrs who died rather than harm their persecutors now produced saints who orchestrated the torture of their opponents. The intellectual destruction was as systematic as the physical violence. Libraries that had survived barbarian invasions and imperial upheavals were gutted by Christian authorities who saw ancient learning as demonic contamination. The Academy of Athens, which had operated continuously for nearly 1,000 years, was close in 529 CE. Fed by imperial order, last philosophers were driven into exile, carrying with them scrolls and memories that would vanish forever. But the most chilling aspect of this cultural annihilation was how it was justified. The bishops who ordered these destructions weren't acting from ignorance or blind hatred. They understood exactly what they were destroying, and they believed it was necessary for the greater good. Ancient wisdom was dangerous because it offered alternative ways of understanding the world. Philosophical inquiry was threatening because it encouraged questions that might challenge official doctrine. The church that had once proclaimed truth would set you free now insisted that certain truths were too dangerous to be known. The movement that had begun with a teacher who welcomed questions from tax collectors and fishermen now created institutions that punished questioning itself. This transformation revealed something profound about what had happened to Christianity under Roman influence. It wasn't just that the church had gained political power. It was that political power had fundamentally altered the church's understanding of truth itself. Truth was no longer something to be discovered through investigation and debate. It was something to be proclaimed by authority and accepted through obedience. The early Christians had been confident enough in their message to engage with anyone, anywhere, about anything. They had debated philosophers in Athens, reasoned with officials in Rome, and answered questions from seekers across the empire. Their confidence came from their conviction that truth could withstand scrutiny, that their message would prove itself through examination. Imperial Christianity took the opposite approach. It protected its version of truth by eliminating alternatives, defended its interpretations by silencing critics, and maintained its authority by punishing doubt. This wasn't confidence. It was insecurity dressed up as orthodoxy. The contrast couldn't have been starker. The Apostle Paul had stood before pagan philosophers and engaged them on their own terms, using their own poets and thinkers to make his case. The bishops of the imperial church stood before pagan philosophers and ordered their execution. Where early Christian apologists had written careful arguments defending their faith against intellectual criticism, imperial Christian authorities simply banned the critics. Where the first generation had welcomed martyrdom rather than compromise their convictions, their successors imposed martyrdom on others to protect their compromises. The machinery of persecution that emerged from this new understanding was more sophisticated than anything the old empire had created. Diocletian's persecutions had been brutal but episodic, driven by imperial whim and implemented by reluctant officials. Christian persecution was methodical, continuous, and carried out by believers who saw violence as a sacred duty. The legal framework was elegant in its simplicity. Heresy became treason, theological dissent became sedition, and alternative worship became rebellion against God and emperor alike. The same legal concepts that had once criminalized Christianity now criminalized anything that wasn't the approved version of Christianity. But the real genius of the system was how it turned persecution into evangelism. The bishops who ordered the destruction of temples claimed they were liberating the people from demonic deception. The officials who closed schools insisted they were protecting students from dangerous ideas. The mobs who murdered philosophers declared they were defending the faith against its enemies. Every act of violence was transformed into an act of love. Every suppression of freedom was redefined as the expansion of truth. Every betrayal of Christianity's original message was presented as faithfulness to that message. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but it was also necessary for the system to function. This is how institutional corruption always works. It doesn't announce itself as corruption. It presents itself as purification. It doesn't admit to betraying original principles. It claims to be fulfilling them more perfectly than ever before. It doesn't acknowledge that it has become the very thing it once opposed. It insists that opposition itself was the problem. The transformation was so complete that within a few generations, most Christians couldn't even imagine their faith existing outside the imperial framework. The idea that Christianity had once thrived as a persecuted minority seemed not just unlikely, but theologically impossible. If God had blessed the church with imperial power, then imperial power must be part of God's plan. If Christian emperors were using violence to spread the faith, then violence must be a legitimate Christian method. The circular logic was perfect and perfectly destructive. Every success of the imperial church proved that God approved of imperial methods. Every failure of alternatives proved that God disapproved of non-imperial approaches. The system had become self-validating, immune to criticism from outside and incapable of reform from within. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this transformation was how it affected ordinary believers. The early Christians had been sustained by communities that practiced radical equality, mutual care, and joyful worship despite external persecution. Imperial Christianity created communities sustained by external power, internal hierarchy, and fearful conformity. The spontaneous gatherings of the house churches gave way to elaborate liturgies conducted by professional clergy. The shared meals of the early communities became ritualized ceremonies that emphasized the distance between priest and people. The prophetic voices that had once spoken truth to power from the margins were replaced by official voices that spoke power's truth from positions of privilege. Where early Christians had been known for their love of enemies and care for outcasts, imperial Christians became known for their hatred of heretics and exclusion of nonconformists. Where the first generation had amazed the world with their generosity toward the poor, their successors amazed the world with their accumulation of wealth for themselves. The faith that had once transformed individuals, who then transformed communities, had become an institution that transformed communities in ways that crushed individuals who dared to maintain the original vision. The gospel that had proclaimed liberation for captives had become a system for creating new forms of captivity. And through it all, the leadership insisted that nothing fundamental had changed. They were still following the same Christ, reading the same scriptures, practicing the same faith. The words were the same, but they had been emptied of their original meaning and filled with content that served imperial purposes. This wasn't just religious evolution or natural institutional development. This was systematic replacement. carried out so of the victims didn't realize what skillfully that even many had happened to them. The hijacking was so successful that it convinced its victims to participate in their own spiritual destruction. The early Christians had faced lions in the arena and emerged victorious through their willingness to die rather than compromise. Imperial Christians faced the temptations of power and prestige and emerged defeated through their willingness to compromise rather than risk losing their comfort. The empire that couldn't destroy Christianity through persecution had successfully destroyed it through patronage. The faith that had survived the worst that Rome could do to it couldn't survive the best that Rome was willing to offer. But the most devastating consequence was still to come, because once Christianity became indistinguishable from empire, it began to spread empire wherever it went. The gospel that had once challenged every earthly power became the justification for earthly powers to expand their reach across the globe. The cross that had once symbolized God's solidarity with the oppressed became the banner under which new forms of oppression marched across continents. The message that had once announced the end of human divisions based on ethnicity, class, and nationality became the excuse for creating new divisions based on religious orthodoxy and imperial citizenship. Rome's greatest victory wasn't conquering Christianity. It was convincing Christianity to conquer the world on Rome's behalf. The hijacking was complete, but the real horror was just beginning to unfold as this transformed faith prepared to export its imperial character to every corner of the earth. The transformation unleashed forces that would reshape civilization itself. Because once Rome had successfully weaponized Christianity, it didn't just use it to control its own subjects. It used it to justify expansion, conquest, and the systematic destruction of cultures that had flourished for millennia. This wasn't gradual cultural exchange or peaceful missionary work. This was imperial Christianity as a tool of conquest, spreading not through the power of its message but through the message of its power. Wherever Roman legions marched, Christian bishops followed, and wherever Christian bishops established themselves, Roman law soon took root. The genius of the system was its ability to transform military conquest into spiritual liberation. When Roman armies conquered a territory, Christian missionaries could claim they were rescuing the people from pagan darkness. When Christian authorities destroyed local traditions, Roman administrators could claim they were establishing civilized order. The two powers worked in perfect harmony, each legitimizing the other's violence. But here's what makes this period so chilling. The bishops who blessed these conquests, the priests who sanctified this violence, the theologians who developed elaborate justifications for cultural destruction, they genuinely believed they were doing God's work. They had been so thoroughly formed by the imperial system that they couldn't distinguish between serving Christ and serving Caesar. Take what happened to the Celtic Christians in Britain and Ireland. These communities had developed their own distinctive forms of worship, their own theological emphasis, their own ways of organizing religious life. They weren't heretics or pagans. They were simply Christians who had never been absorbed into the Roman system. That made them dangerous. Not because they threatened anyone's safety or challenged anyone's legitimate authority, but because they demonstrated that Christianity could exist and thrive outside imperial control. Their very existence was a rebuke to the claim that Roman Christianity was the only authentic form of the faith. The solution was systematic absorption or elimination. Celtic monasteries were forced to adopt Roman practices or face closure. Celtic clergy were required to accept Roman authority or lose their positions. Celtic theological traditions were suppressed in favor of Roman interpretations. Within a few generations, a vibrant and distinctive Christian culture had been either destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. The same pattern repeated across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Wherever imperial Christianity encountered alternative forms of the faith, the result was the same: conform, or disappear. The diversity that had once characterized Christianity was systematically eliminated in favor of uniformity that served imperial purposes. But the most insidious aspect of this process was how it corrupted the very concept of Christian mission. The early Christians had spread their faith through example, service, and persuasion. They had attracted converts not through coercion, but through the compelling witness of transformed lives and communities. Imperial Christianity developed a very different approach. Conversion became a matter of political necessity rather than spiritual conviction. Territories that submitted to Roman rule were expected to submit to Roman religion as well. Resistance to Christian authority became treason against imperial law. The missionaries who carried out this work weren't necessarily cynical manipulators, though some certainly were. Many of them genuinely believed that forced conversion was better than no conversion at all. They had been taught that saving souls justified almost any method, that eternal truth was more important than temporal freedom, that spiritual liberation was worth any amount of physical coercion. This theological framework created a new kind of religious worker, one who could burn libraries while claiming to spread knowledge, who could destroy cultures while claiming to bring civilization, who could impose slavery while claiming to offer freedom. The cognitive dissonance was maintained through elaborate theological systems that redefined every contradiction as a divine mystery. The results were catastrophic for human civilization. Libraries that had preserved ancient wisdom for centuries were reduced to ashes by Christians who believed they were protecting truth. Philosophical traditions that had grappled with ultimate questions for generations were silenced by authorities who claimed to have final answers. Scientific investigations that had expanded human understanding were abandoned in favor of official doctrines that couldn't be questioned. But perhaps the most devastating loss was the destruction of alternative ways of understanding Christianity itself. The imperial church didn't just eliminate pagan religions, it eliminated Christian alternatives to imperial Christianity. Mystics' direct experience over institutional who emphasize authority were condemned as heretics. Communities that practiced economic sharing were disbanded as threats to social order. Leaders who challenged the marriage of church and state were exiled as enemies of both. The Christianity that emerged from this process of systematic elimination was something unprecedented in human history. It was a religion that claimed to follow the Prince of Peace while blessing every war that served its interests. It proclaimed good news to the poor while accumulating wealth that exceeded the treasuries of ancient kingdoms. It announced liberation for captives while creating new forms of spiritual bondage more sophisticated than anything the world had ever seen. The transformation wasn't just institutional, it was psychological. The imperial church developed new ways of thinking about faith, authority, and human nature itself. Where early Christians had emphasized the potential for divine transformation in every person, imperial Christianity emphasized the need for institutional mediation of divine grace. Where the first generation had trusted communities to discern spiritual truth together, their successors insisted that truth could only be determined by official authorities. This shift in understanding had profound implications for how Christians related to power, wealth, and social responsibility. The early believers had seen earthly possessions as temporary stewardship and earthly authorities as provisional arrangements that would be swept away by God's kingdom. Imperial Christians began to see earthly success as evidence of divine favor and earthly authorities as instruments of divine will. The result was a religious system that could baptize any arrangement of power as long as it served the institutional interests of the church. Slavery could be justified as God's natural order. War could be sanctified as holy crusade. Economic exploitation could be defended as divine providence. The flexibility was remarkable and remarkably dangerous. This theological framework spread wherever imperial Christianity established itself, creating societies that combined religious language with imperial methods. The cross became not just a symbol of sacrifice, but a banner of conquest. The gospel became not just good news for the oppressed, but justification for new forms of oppression. The church became not just a community of believers, but an arm of state power. The irony was devastating. The movement that had begun as the ultimate challenge to imperial power had become imperial power's most effective tool. The faith that had proclaimed God's judgment on earthly kingdoms had become the divine sanction for earthly kingdoms to expand their reach. The religion that had announced the end of human divisions had become the excuse for creating new and more sophisticated forms of division. But the most tragic aspect of this transformation was how it affected the very people the original gospel had been intended to reach. The poor, the outcast, the marginalized, the oppressed, these had been the primary audience for Jesus' message. They had found in early Christianity a vision of human dignity and divine love that challenged every system that devalued their lives. Imperial Christianity offered them something very different. Instead of challenging the systems that oppressed them, it taught them to accept their oppression as God's will. Instead of proclaiming their inherent worth as bearers of divine image, it emphasized their need for institutional mediation to access divine grace. Instead of empowering them to transform their circumstances, it encouraged them to endure their circumstances in hope of heavenly reward. The message that had once been revolutionary became conservative. The faith that had once challenged every form of injustice became the defender of unjust systems. The religion that had once turned the world upside down became the mechanism for keeping the world right side up, no matter how wrong that world had become. This wasn't just a betrayal of Christianity's original message. It was a betrayal of the very people that message had been intended to serve. The gospel that had announced good news to the poor became bad news for the poor. The faith that had proclaimed liberation for captives became a new form of captivity. The religion that had promised the last would be first became a system for ensuring the first would always remain first. The transformation created a religious establishment that could coexist comfortably with any amount of injustice, as long as that injustice didn't threaten its own institutional interests. Poverty, slavery, war, exploitation, all of these could be tolerated and even blessed as long as they served the larger purposes of maintaining social order and institutional stability. This is how the hijacking reached its final, most complete form. Rome didn't just capture Christianity's institutions, it captured Christianity's imagination. It didn't just redirect Christian energy, it redefined what Christian energy should be directed toward. It didn't just co-opt Christian leadership, it transformed the very concept of what Christian leadership meant. The bishops who emerged from this process weren't just different from the apostles in their methods, they were different in their fundamental understanding of what they were supposed to be doing. Where the apostles had seen themselves as servants of a message that challenged every earthly power, the bishops saw themselves as administrators of an institution that worked with earthly powers to maintain social stability. Where the early evangelists had proclaimed a kingdom that turned worldly values upside down, their successors proclaimed a kingdom that blessed worldly values as long as they were expressed through proper channels. Where the first generation had been willing to die rather than compromise their witness, later generations were willing to kill rather than risk their institutional position. The result was a form of Christianity that was Christian in name, but Roman in character, Christian in vocabulary but imperial in substance, Christian in appearance but pagan in practice. The hijacking was so complete that most people couldn't even see it had happened. They looked at the imperial church and saw Christianity. They looked at the bishops in purple robes and saw apostolic succession. They looked at the elaborate ceremonies and saw authentic worship. but a few could still remember. Hidden in monasteries, preserved in secret traditions, carried by communities that had somehow escaped the imperial embrace, fragments of the original vision survived. These remnants would occasionally surface, challenging the imperial consensus, calling the institutional church back to its abandoned roots, reminding the world of what Christianity had been before Rome got its hands on it. And whenever they appeared, they faced the same fate that had befallen Jesus himself. They were condemned by religious authorities, betrayed by political leaders, and destroyed by the very system they had tried to reform. The imperial church had become so thoroughly Roman that it treated authentic Christianity the same way Rome had always treated authentic Christianity as a threat that needed to be eliminated. This pattern would repeat throughout the centuries that followed, as the hijacked faith spread its imperial character across continents and cultures, leaving behind a trail of conquest, conversion, and cultural destruction that stretched from Ireland to India, from Scandinavia to South America. The cross that had once stood for God's solidarity with the oppressed had become the symbol under which the oppressed were systematically crushed in God's name. But even as the imperial system reached the height of its power and influence, cracks were beginning to appear in its foundation. Because no matter how successfully you can hijack a message, you can never completely destroy its original power. And the original power of Christianity, its radical vision of human dignity, divine love, and social transformation, would continue to surface in unexpected places, challenging the very system that claimed to represent it. The hijacking was complete, but the story was far from over. Because empires, no matter how sophisticated their methods of control, always contain the seeds of their own destruction. And the seeds of Christianity's liberation from its Roman captors were already beginning to sprout in places the imperial authorities had never thought to look. The cracks appeared first in the places Rome least expected to find them. Because while the imperial church was busy congratulating itself on its magnificent cathedrals and elaborate ceremonies, something dangerous was stirring in the shadows of its own success. It started in the monasteries, those supposed bastions of orthodox conformity, where monks had retreated from the world to focus on prayer and contemplation. The irony was perfect. The institutional church had encouraged monasticism as a way to channel potentially disruptive religious energy into harmless spiritual exercises. What they got instead were communities of people who actually read the scriptures they were copying. And when you spend your days transcribing the words of Jesus while living in luxury that would have scandalized the apostles, certain uncomfortable questions begin to surface. Questions like, why does the church own more land than the emperor? Why do bishops live in palaces while Christ had nowhere to lay his head? Why are we blessing wars when the gospel commands us to love our enemies? These weren't theological abstractions to the monks who were asking them. These were daily contradictions they lived with every time they copied another page of Scripture that condemned the very lifestyle their institution had embraced. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable for some of them, and when cognitive dissonance becomes unbearable, people either surrender their minds or recover their souls. Some chose surrender, developing increasingly elaborate theological gymnastics to explain away the contradictions. But others chose recovery, and that's where things got dangerous for the imperial system. The first crack appeared when a monk named Anthony read Jesus' command to sell everything and give to the poor, and actually took it literally. This wasn't supposed to happen. The institutional church had spent centuries developing sophisticated interpretations of such passages that rendered them safely symbolic. But Anthony missed the memo about sophisticated interpretation and simply did what the text said. He sold his possessions, gave the money to the poor, and walked into the Egyptian desert to live as the early Christians had lived, dependent on God rather than institutional support. free from the compromises that came with wealth and political connections, answerable to Scripture rather than ecclesiastical hierarchy. The church authorities were horrified. This wasn't just individual eccentricity, this was a direct challenge to the entire system they had built. If Christians started actually following the teachings they claimed to believe, the whole imperial arrangement would collapse. Bishops couldn't live like princes if their followers started expecting them to live like apostles. But Anthony wasn't alone. His example spread like wildfire through communities that had been waiting for someone to show them it was possible to be Christian without being Roman. Within decades, the Egyptian desert was populated by thousands of men and women who had abandoned the comfortable compromises of imperial Christianity for the dangerous authenticity of the gospel. They called themselves the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and they represented everything the institutional church had tried to eliminate. They were poor by choice rather than circumstance. They were independent of political authority rather than dependent on it. They were sustained by spiritual conviction rather than material security. They were, in other words, what Christians had been before Constantine got his hands on them. The imperial church tried to co-opt this movement just as it had co-opted everything else. They declared Anthony a saint, built churches in his honor, and incorporated monastic communities into the official ecclesiastical structure. But co-optation only works when the people being co-opted want something the system can provide. The desert monks wanted nothing the system had to offer except to be left alone to follow Christ without imperial interference. This created a new and unprecedented problem for the Roman approach to religious control. Previous dissident movements had wanted power, or wealth, or recognition, things the system could either provide or withhold to ensure compliance. But how do you control people who have voluntarily given up everything you might use to control them? The answer was violence, the same solution Rome had always used when other methods failed. But violence against monks created a different kind of problem than violence against other dissidents. When you martyr people who are trying to accumulate wealth or seize power, you can portray them as criminals getting their just deserts. But when you martyr people who have given up wealth and power to follow Christ more faithfully, you reveal the true character of your own system. This dilemma exposed the fundamental weakness in Rome's hijacking strategy. The imperial system could co-opt Christianity as long as Christians wanted things the empire could provide. But it couldn't control Christians who had recovered the original vision of a kingdom not of this world, who had rediscovered the revolutionary power of voluntary poverty, who had remembered what it meant to be citizens of heaven rather than Rome. The desert movement spread beyond Egypt, creating communities of authentic Christian practice throughout the empire and beyond. In Syria, monks lived only concerns. In Ireland, pillars to demonstrate their independence from earthed Celtic monasteries preserved learning and spiritual traditions that had been destroyed elsewhere. In the mountains of Armenia and Ethiopia, Christian communities maintained their independence from both Roman and Byzantine imperial control. Each of these communities represented a crack in the imperial facade, a reminder of what Christianity had been and could be again. They weren't organized as a movement or coordinated as a resistance network, but their very existence challenged the legitimacy of the institutional church that claimed to represent the same Christ they were actually following. The institutional response was predictable, but ultimately counterproductive. The more the imperial church tried to suppress or co-opt these authentic Christian communities, the more obvious it became that the institution had become the enemy of the very faith it claimed to represent. The more violently bishops enforced conformity, the more clearly they revealed that they had more in common with Pontius Pilate than with the apostles. But the most damaging crack appeared not in remote monasteries or distant communities, but in the heart of the imperial system itself. Because some of the people who had been trained to serve as instruments of ecclesiastical control began to read the scriptures they were supposed to be interpreting, and discovered that those scriptures condemned everything they had been taught to defend. These weren't wild-eyed mystics or political revolutionaries. These were scholars, theologians, and even bishops who had been thoroughly educated in the imperial system, but who couldn't ignore the growing contradiction between what they were teaching and what they were reading. The cognitive dissonance that had driven monks into the desert began driving church intellectuals toward conclusions that threatened the entire institutional structure. Some of them tried to work within the system, developing reforms that might restore some connection between Christian practice and Christian teaching. But they quickly discovered that the system wasn't interested in reform, it was interested in control. Any suggestion that the church should actually follow Christ's teachings was treated as heresy. Any proposal that bishops should live like apostles was condemned as dangerous radicalism. This created a new category of dissidents, people who weren't challenging Christian doctrine, but who were challenging the unchristian practices of Christian institutions. They weren't heretics in any theological sense. They were simply Christians who insisted that Christianity should be Christian. But in the imperial system, that was the most dangerous heresy of all. The institutional church had developed such sophisticated methods of theological justification that it could explain away any contradiction between its practices and Christ's teachings. Wealth was necessary for effective ministry. Political power was required to protect the faith. Violence was sometimes needed to defend truth. Every betrayal of the gospel could be reframed as service to the gospel. But these justifications only worked as long as people accepted the assumption that institutional survival was more important than gospel fidelity. Once Christians began questioning that assumption, the whole elaborate structure of rationalization collapsed. If following Christ was more important than preserving the church, then maybe the church needed to be reformed rather than Christ's teachings being reinterpreted. This shift in priorities created a crisis that went beyond individual dissent or local rebellion. It challenged the fundamental premise on which the entire imperial system was built, the idea that serving institutional interests was the same as serving God's interests. Once that equation was questioned, everything else became questionable too. The crisis deepened when some of these dissidents began reaching back to sources the institutional church had tried to suppress or reinterpret. They discovered writings from the pre-Constantinian period that described Christian communities very different from what they were seeing in their own time. They found accounts of bishops who lived in poverty rather than luxury, of churches that practiced economic sharing rather than wealth accumulation, of Christians who refused military service rather than blessing holy wars. These discoveries were devastating to the imperial narrative. The institutional church had claimed that its practices represented the natural development of apostolic Christianity, the mature form toward which the early church had always been evolving. But the historical record showed something very different. A dramatic break, a fundamental transformation, a hijacking so complete that the later church bore almost no resemblance to its origins. Armed with this historical evidence and motivated by spiritual conviction, reformers began calling for the church to return to its roots. They demanded that bishops live like apostles, that churches practice like the early communities, that Christianity become Christian again. These weren't calls for innovation but for restoration, not for new practices but for the recovery of abandoned ones. The institutional response was swift and brutal. Reformers were condemned as heretics, their writings were burned, their followers were persecuted. The same machinery of suppression that had been used against pagans and alternative Christian traditions was now turned against Christians who insisted on taking Christianity seriously. But persecution of authentic Christians created a different kind of problem than persecution of heretics or pagans. When you burn the books of philosophers, you can claim you're protecting truth. When you execute pagan priests, you can argue you're defending the faith. But when you persecute people for trying to follow Christ too faithfully, you reveal that your system has become the enemy of the very person it claims to serve. This is the story they don't want you to know. For over 1,500 years, the institutional church has successfully convinced the world that its imperial Christianity is the only Christianity that ever existed. They've buried the evidence, silenced the witnesses, and rewritten the history books to hide the greatest theft in human history. But the truth has a way of surfacing. In forgotten manuscripts, in archaeological discoveries, in the testimonies of those brave enough to look beyond the official narrative, the original Christianity keeps breaking through. The movement that began with fishermen and tax collectors, that spread through love rather than conquest, that chose martyrdom over compromise, that Christianity never really died. It just went underground, waiting for people courageous enough to reclaim what Rome stole from the world.